A Process of Elimination, written by the Seven Saviors. Part 2. Chapter 4. The Noble Cult. For as many foolish and inane plans as I'd made, none of them wound up coming to fruition. It was the day after I'd made those plans that my life as Princess Celestia's student really began, and by then I found myself far too busy to even see Crimson Storm again, let alone spy on either her or Blue Blood. Days turned into weeks, and between my studies and personal lessons with Celestia, I eventually got so caught up in being a student that I more or less forgot about the whole situation altogether in favor of making sure I did my mentor proud. Not helping matters was the fact that I'd seen neither hide nor hair of the red mare in the following days. For the first few days after I'd written down my plans, I tried to find her with what little time I had available to me, to no avail. I was upset about it, to be sure, but I soon decided that my obligations to the princess came first, so I stopped looking not too long after that. I had seen Captain Blueblood a few times, but didn't have the nerve to ask him where Crimson was. It wasn't until I'd completely given up and moved on that I finally saw her again, and not in the way I'd expected to. I learned a few horrible things that night about Crimson Storm, Captain Blueblood, and myself as well. For me though, it was more that, for the first time since I'd woken up in the hospital after the incident, I was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth that I'd known about myself for quite some time, but never truly acknowledged. It all began when I was introduced to Captain Blueblood's son, Blueblood VII, during a lull in my sessions. That year's Grand Galloping Gala was just around the corner, and the entire castle staff was in a frenzy trying to prepare for the event, even though it wasn't supposed to be held for another week. I was able to attend the event as the princess's little lady-in-waiting, much to my complete disbelief. By that time, Princess Celestia and I had grown fairly close, and the whole thing had been her idea. I'd nearly fainted at the notion, but that just amused her all the more, making me think it was all some sort of joke at my expense. The role was genuine, however, and Celestia had put my lessons on hold in order to prepare me for it, as well as oversee the actual event preparations. At the same time, I was urged by the princess to spend some time away from my studies. There were a lot of ponies coming in from all over Equestria to attend, including parents and their foals. Some of these ponies were invited to stay in the guest rooms at the castle itself, and Celestia thought I should take the opportunity to try and mingle with some of the other colts and fillies my age. The problem was that the other colts and fillies my age were the sons and daughters of wealthy high society ponies. I had already grown wary of nobles by this point, and knew nothing good would come out of my attempts at friendship with the other foals. Still, I tried for Celestia's sake, and went out of my way to communicate with the others, something I would come soon to regret. A couple days after Celestia told me to try and make some friends, I found my chance during a visit to the Royal Gardens. I had only meant to pass by on my way to the archives to sneak in a bit more studying when I spotted a trio of unicorn foals in the distance, trotting amongst the many statues. Though the princess had told me there were foals out and about, I hadn't really seen any up until this point, and figured I'd rather get this out of the way sooner rather than later. As the trio moved through the small forest of statues on display, I quietly followed after them. The group consisted of a short and pudgy colt with a grayish coat and a curly teal mane and tail, a giggly filly with a seafoam green coat and a burgundy-colored mane and tail, and a tall colt with a light gray coat and amber mane and tail. The tall colt seemed to be the oldest of the three, though I couldn't tell by how much. There was something about the large colt that seemed oddly familiar, but at the time, I couldn't place my hoof on what it was. I watched as they all stopped in front of a marble-carved statue of a stern-looking unicorn stallion in what looked like old-fashioned, formal military attire, rearing on his hind legs. The statue itself wasn't important to me, but in my endless need to impress my mentor, I'd memorized the history behind each and every statue in the garden, and that knowledge was what I felt would be important now. Each of the foals stood before the statue, with the tall colt eyeing it with an almost smug sense of superiority, as though he was the one that had carved it himself. For a moment, none of them said anything, and as I watched, I could see the white colt frowning slightly as he cast an expectant gaze backwards at the other two. Neither of them said anything, however, and simply returned the look with confused stares between the light gray colt and the statue. I heard the colt give an exasperated sigh, and turned to face the others with an annoyed scowl. "Do either of you imbeciles know who this is?" he snapped. "Not a clue, no." I sensed my opportunity and waited for the right moment to pounce on it as he spoke again. The pudgy gray colt tilted his head and squinted at the statue in bemusement before looking back to the taller colt. "Sorry, Blue Blood, but I don't have a clue on who this stallion is," the rotund gray colt replied with a nervous smile. "Should we?" My eyes widened at the mention of the colt's name, and my smile widened as the memory of all those plans I'd written came back to me. That colt must have been the son of the captain, and if I could get him on my good side, then I might be able to learn more about his father. I went to step out past the hedge I was hiding behind and introduce myself, but the baleful glare Blue Blood gave the other colt made me pause. The smaller colt cringed back, and the filly giggled nervously before speaking up. "Well, obviously, he's a soldier of some renown," she replied, trying and failing to sound like she knew what she was talking about. "I'm certain Everypony who's Everypony knows about this stallion and what he's done for Equestria and the princess." Blue Blood whipped around to face the filly, narrowing his eyes. "And tell me, Winterchime," Blue Blood answered slowly and deliberately, "what, pray tell, is this stallion famous for specifically? What has he contributed to our great nation and her royal highness, He took a forceful step towards the filly, who stumbled back, her nervous grin morphing into something more panicked as Blue Blood spoke. "Do you even know his name?" "Well, I mean, he's..." She trailed off and giggled again, much to Blue Blood's frustration. He sneered down at the other two foals and was about to reply when I finally stepped out and spoke up. "General Ironblood III," I explained with a hint of pride. The others snapped their gazes over to me, and my own smile widened at their surprise as I continued. "A distinguished general from back when Equestria still had a standing army, rather than the royal EUP guard we have today." There was a heartbeat of silence as I waited for the others to respond, and then... "Excuse me?" the filly suddenly snarled, causing me to flinch back in surprise and my ears to lower in dismay. I took a step back as she glared at me, her eyes blazing and her voice shrill with indignation. "Who in Equestria do you think you are to just show up out of nowhere and..." She narrowed her eyes slightly before speaking in a low, thoughtful tone. Wait a minute. Aren't you..." A light gray hoof held her back as she began to advance, and she blinked in silent bewilderment before turning to Blue Blood. The colt held her back, but his eyes were focused on me, a small smirk playing across his face. "Ignore this idiot," he said calmly, his arctic blue eyes roaming over me with interest as he lowered his hoof. "She likes to talk posture, but rarely has anything of worth to say. Please, continue." His tone was polite, but I could hear the casual disregard for the filly next to him, and from the indignant and somewhat hurt look she tried to cover up, I could tell the filly heard it too. That aside, something about the colt's gaze made me shudder in disgust in a similar way to when I met his father. I suddenly wanted to leave right then and there, but I resisted the urge and pushed on, unwilling to waste the opportunity given to me. I cleared my throat and tried to smile as I continued my explanation, but it just came out as an odd mix between a nervous smile and a worried grimace. "Well, I shuffled awkwardly, suddenly all too aware of my shyness and aptitude when it came to talking to the other foals my age. General Ironblood, that is, made a name for himself during the Battle of Horseshoe Bay, when he and a small contingent of his own soldiers, mostly consisting of unicorns and pegasi, successfully managed to fend off a larger group of minotaurs trying to invade Baltimore by way of the Celestial Sea. And? Blueblood pressed, taking a step forward. Go on. There's more to be told, right? Right. I was beginning to regret my decision more and more as time went on, and wanted nothing more than to hide in a hole somewhere, but I continued on. Well, for his outstanding service in the war against the Republic of Minos, he was awarded the Equestrian Badge of Honor given to him by Princess Celestia herself. And what else? Blueblood urged, smiling in anticipation. Surely you know what became of Ironblood and his family, right? What became of the Ironblood family name? No, not really, I replied sheepishly. I haven't really looked into his genealogy. Sorry. Blueblood's smile fell into a disappointed frown, and with a heavy sigh, he retreated back to where he stood before. He huffed and pushed a stray lock of his long amber mane out of his face before giving me a sardonic smile. Well, that's a pity, he said, his tone as light and charming as he could make it. But I suppose you know more than these two simpletons, so that's something to be commended. He ignored the two grumbling and stuttering foals behind him and trotted up to me. This close, I could definitely tell he was older by a few years. Certainly older than me, but not quite as old as my brother. This did nothing to comfort me, but I held my ground for the moment as he continued to explain. It was actually the Ironblood family that the noble Blueblood house was born, with the grandson of Ironblood III at the helm, he said matter-of-factly. Rather than become a soldier like his father and father's father before him, Ironblood V decided to take up the seat on the then newly formed council in the then newly built city of Canterlot. Really? I replied, genuinely surprised and a bit intrigued despite myself. I haven't done too much research on the early days of Canterlot's governing body, at least, not yet. Oh, you really should take some more time to look into it, Blueblood replied with a small indulgent chuckle. It's quite the fascinating study, if I do say so myself. Celestia still held a very large portion of the power, to be sure, but to let a group of elected ponies oversee the day-to-day issues of the city was unheard of, and caused quite a bit of a stir if the stories are to be believed. He chuckled again and brought both our attention back over to the statue as he spoke. No longer did the princess rule alone, as far as the city went at any rate, he said in a wistful tone, almost as if he himself had been there in that time. She'd given other ponies power, a piece of the pie, so to speak, and over time, the noble houses, which held little power at the time, grew into something grand and magnificent. He turned back to me, his smile widening with pride, and his icy eyes sparkling with something I couldn't quite place at the time. Whatever it was, it deepened the unease I felt, and I couldn't help but take a step back. Unlike his fathers before him, Ironblood V used his wit rather than his brawn to secure his family's name as the most powerful noble house in Canterlot, Blueblood continued in an almost reverent tone. Through a political marriage, he became a relative of the princess herself, and as a sign of his family's newfound status, he changed the family name from Ironblood to Blueblood, and took up the title of the first Prince of Nobles, Prince Blueblood I. I was still trying to take the new information in when Blueblood moved closer, raising his head proudly, and put a hoof on my chest. And I am next in line to inherit the title, he exclaimed, inclining his head slightly. My name is Blueblood VII, son of the captain of the Royal Guard and current Prince Blueblood VI. As though it was an afterthought, he turned and gestured to the other foals behind him, his expression growing somewhat dull and disinterested. "This is Winterchime," he said, pointing to the nodding filly. "Her mother, Winterbell, is the current Chief Justice of Canterlot's Supreme Court. And this—" His frown deepened almost imperceptibly as he turned his attention to the smirking gray colt. "Is Greedy Gut. His father, Stingy Gut, owns several of the banks, not just in Canterlot, but in Manhattan and Baltimore as well." The other two went to introduce themselves, but Blueblood silenced them with a look before turning back to me with a kind smile. That smile, coupled with the way he treated what I initially assumed were his friends, set me on edge, and I returned his easy smile with a weak one of my own. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss—" Blueblood paused expectantly, and I blinked stupidly for a moment before registering that I was supposed to introduce myself. Flustered, I chuckled awkwardly and stuttered out an introduction. I'm Twilight. Twilight Sparkle," I replied lamely. I just became Princess Celestia's personal protege a little over a month ago." "Her protege, you say?" Blueblood replied with an intrigued raise of his brow. "Well, this is a pleasant surprise now, isn't it?" He trotted around me, looking me up and down with that small smirk from earlier. "In fact, I'd say this was a fortuitous meeting for the both of us." "It is?" I asked, both dumbfounded and wary. "How so?" "I bet you've grown pretty close to the princess, haven't you?" Blueblood asked pointedly. "What with the personal lessons and everything, yes?" "Well, yeah, I guess so," I replied, furrowing my brow. "But why does that matter?" His smirk widened a touch in response, and I had to suppress a shiver. "In that case, I think we might be able to help each other," he answered. "If you're as close to the princess as I think you are, you might be able to help me and some of my friends, given time, of course." "What do you mean?" I asked, growing more wary by the second. "How can I help a pony like you? I'm not really poor, but I'm not exactly a noble either." "Oh, don't worry about that," Blueblood replied with a dismissive wave of his hoof. "I'm sure we can still be friends, and who knows, maybe with a bit of help from my father's current friends, we can even remedy that." "Remedy what?" I took another step back, and my frown grew more pronounced. "Are you saying you can make me a noble or something?" I had a bad feeling about where this was headed, but at the same time, I had a chance to find out more about his father and maybe Crimson Storm if I was lucky. Even so, however, I could hear Crimson's voice in my head. I could hear the utter contempt in her voice when she talked about the nobles, and that gave me pause. "Well, I'm not promising that much, but I can definitely make your life easier," Blueblood replied. He paused a moment. "Well, I can't personally, but I know ponies that can, and all I ask in return is a few favors." "I don't know," I replied hesitantly. "I'm pretty sure you're overestimating how much power I actually have. Yeah, Princess Celestia and I have grown pretty close, but I'm still just a filly, and she's the princess. I can't just ask her to do a bunch of stuff for me." "Oh," the tall colt replied with a raised brow. "I don't think you're giving yourself and your position enough credit." He chuckled knowingly and moved to stand before the other two. "I'm not asking for anything major right at this very moment. I just want you to remember me for now, and what my father and I can offer." He fell silent, and his gaze intensified for a brief moment. I wondered what he'd say next, and I was surprised when he trotted right up to me and held his hoof out. I looked at his hoof, then to the other two foals behind him, noting the filly's studiously blank expression and the other colt's wide, stupid grin. After a moment, I returned my bemused gaze to Blueblood. He simply smiled in response as he held out his hoof. "What say you, Twilight Sparkle? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and maybe, with a bit of time, we can all be good friends." Chapter 5. The Proposal. I never gave Blueblood an outright answer to his offer, but he didn't seem to mind. On the contrary, the noble cult, much to my surprise and suspicion, seemed content to let me stew on the matter for as long as I wanted. In the meantime, probably in an effort to win me over, he insisted I hang out with him and his cohorts until the gala kicked off. Every fiber of my being told me not to go, told me that it was a terrible idea, but I was a shy and meek little fool. Maybe not as shy and meek as a certain mare, but it was enough that I was easily susceptible to peer pressure, a concept I had yet to truly experience up until that point. Reluctantly, but surely, I agreed, and spent the rest of the day and most of the week leading up to the gala seeing just how the richer foals of society lived and acted. I don't know how I managed to stomach it, even as a foal myself. I suppose I just kept telling myself to do it for Crimson Storm and the princess, the former of whom I still hadn't seen. In any case, I followed the three rich foals around as they wandered the castle and mingled with a few of the other foals, as well as some of the more important adults staying at the castle for the gala. I listened as they talked about things I neither knew nor cared about, mostly things about themselves and their family's exploits, assets, or just general self-aggrandizing nonsense. I was more or less ignored for the most part, except when it was convenient for me to be brought up in the conversation. Whenever I was spoken about, it was usually in the context of the incident involving the nearly catastrophic magic surge I'd suffered during the exam. The topic made me uncomfortable and self-conscious, and the more it was brought up, the more withdrawn I grew. Not helping matters was how I was talked about, but never directly talked to. It was as though I wasn't even there, and I couldn't bring myself to say anything about it because of the guilt and shame I felt whenever they talked about the consequences of my actions. I learned just how far-reaching the damage I could have caused, and in some cases did cause, stretched, and it made me feel horrible. It made me feel like I'd failed, even though I'd gotten my cutie mark and became Celestia's protege. It made me feel as though I hadn't earned it, and over time, I'd started to believe it. After all, what did I really do other than damage the school property and put ponies' lives in danger? I put the princess's life in danger, and laughed all the while like some crazy pony. I began to feel nausea mixed with the odd giddiness I'd feel every time I thought about the incident, and the combination made me feel sick and miserable. Blueblood did nothing to dissuade the insults and dirty looks of the other nobles, at least not in their presence. It was only when we were all out of sight that he said anything about it, offering me words of apology and consolation, giving me his best encouraging smile. And like the naive little filly I was, I wiped away my tears, smiled back, and thanked him for his support. I've said it before, but I wasn't a social butterfly, and while I wasn't as bad as Crimson, I still had little experience when it came to how foals treated other foals, how the rich treated every pony else, and most importantly, how some pony was raised to know how to get what they want, manipulated the ignorant pony who had access to what they wanted. I was that ignorant pony, and before I knew it, I'd gotten mixed up in Blueblood's machinations. He had been a foal like me, but he was intelligent and cunning, no doubt due to his upbringing. I didn't know that, and the more he comforted me, the more I came to see him as a friend, a lifeline in the rolling sea of scorn and self-importance that was the community of Canterlot nobles. I didn't even question the fact that he'd gotten rid of his two companions at some point. If anything, I was grateful for it, as they hadn't been nearly as nice as the older cult. Winterchime in particular seemed to have it out for me for some reason, and I was all too happy not to see her anymore. The entirety of that week, at least when I wasn't with the princess, was spent in the company of the wealthy, whether I was with Blueblood or not. As the gala drew closer, More and more nobles could be seen hanging about the castle, and you couldn't go anywhere without seeing at least a few in the area. The castle suffered at the hooves of some of the more temperamental of the nobles, and I did the best I could to help out with the preparation, but as the week before the gala neared its end, I found I just didn't have the time. About 2 days before the night of the gala, Blueblood approached me, his expression pleasant and unamusing. There was something in his smile that made me uneasy, but by this point, I'd fully considered Blueblood a pony I could trust. The only pony I could trust besides the princess. To me, he was the first true friend I'd made since coming to the castle, not counting my full sitter Cadence and my older brother, that is, and so I ignored the feeling and listened to what he had to say. He caught me just as I was on my way to have breakfast with the princess that morning, stopping me in the corridor just outside my bedroom. "Blueblood?" I asked, giving the smiling colt a bemused frown. "What are you doing here so early?" "I'm sorry for holding you up, Twilight," he replied, bowing his head apologetically. "I'd heard that it was common for you to dine with the princess during breakfast hours, and I'd hoped to meet you before then." "Really?" I replied, wondering just what Blueblood could want now of all times. "What for? Did something happen?" No, nothing like that," Blueblood assured, raising a hoof. "I simply wanted to talk to you about the little matter we discussed when we first met, is all." "When we met?" I furrowed my brow in thought a moment before realization struck. My ears flattened, and I swallowed nervously before replying. Oh, right. That." I scraped a hoof against the floor and gave Blueblood an apologetic frown. "I'm sorry, Blueblood. You helped me a lot and I appreciate that, but I can't just ask the princess for favors like that." Blueblood's smile dipped ever so slightly. "I see," he said quietly before taking a step forward. "I understand your hesitation, Twilight. You respect the princess a great deal, and you don't want to feel like you're manipulating her into doing what you want. I get it. But won't you at least hear me out?" I swallowed again and looked away a moment, checking to make sure the halls were relatively empty before returning a nervous gaze back to Blueblood. All right. Fine. I guess I can at least hear what you want." "That's all I ask," Blueblood replied. His smile returned in full as he stepped away. "I'm sure you've met my father at some point, yes? Prince Blueblood VI, current captain of the guard?" "I've met him," I replied, now fully on guard for what came next. "What about him?" "Well, you see," Blueblood began, leaning in close and speaking in a conspiratorial whisper. "My father is, as of right now, unmarried and desires to take a bride." "Unmarried?" I repeated, surprised at the notion. "But what about your mom? They aren't together?" "I'm afraid not," Blueblood sighed despondently. "My father's previous wife, my mother, was discovered in a, compromising position with another stallion some time ago." His face scrunched into a nasty sneer. "She and my father have since divorced each other, and we no longer speak." "Oh, I didn't know that," I responded quietly. I wasn't quite sure what he meant back then, but I did know that ponies rarely severed the sacred bonds of marriage. For the captain to cut off his marital ties to his wife, she must have done something heinous. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." "Please, don't worry about me, my friend," Blueblood replied, waving the matter away with a dismissive hoof. "It's all in the past now, and I've moved on." His serious expression returned a second later. "My father wishes to do the same, and it's for the reason that I ask your help." "But what can I do?" I asked, bemused, but much more willing to listen now that I knew the details. "How is me being close to the princess gonna help you with your dad?" "After my mother's betrayal, my father fell into some bad habits." Blueblood grimaced, as though remembering some particularly unpleasant memory.
For his sake, I won't go into details. But believe me when I say he needs all the help I, as his son and sole heir, can possibly give him.
I mulled Blueblood's words over in my mind for a few good moments, searching his eyes for something, though not knowing what exactly. A week ago, I wouldn't have been able to do such a thing, but another reason I'd grown to enjoy Blueblood's company was that he inspired a confidence I didn't normally feel all that often. Looking at him, I could see his concern was genuine, and after another moment, I smiled and nodded. It was possible that the reason his father gave off such bad vibes was that he was still bitter about the divorce, I thought. Maybe he was just lashing out. Maybe his off-putting attitude was a mask to hide his pain. All right, if it'll help your dad, then I'll talk to the princess for you, I replied. What did you need me to say?
Excellent,
Blueblood laughed, his smile brightening.
I knew I'd be able to count on you, Twilight. Now then.
He composed himself and spoke quietly.
My father has been searching for another mare to take my mother's place, and has become quite smitten with a certain Pegasus from his guard.
Something twitched in the back of my mind, and my smile slipped slightly. A thought was beginning to form, but I ignored it as I continued to listen to Blueblood.
I'm not sure if you're aware, he continued, but during times of peace, and as long as there are others capable of filling their roles, captains are given a certain amount to leave each year to do with as they see fit. And my father wants to spend his time getting to know this mare better.
Okay, I replied, ignoring the small knot of unease in my stomach. So, he wants to, what, go on a date with the mare?
Something like that,
came the cryptic reply, the quiet tone of which did nothing to settle my sudden unease.
The problem is, the mare doesn't have the same privilege, and even with his rank, my father can't simply excuse her from her duties. What I'd like you to do is convince the princess to allow my father to take the mare with him on leave.
Well, I responded, growing more unsure by the second. Can't he, try to ask the princess himself? Blueblood frowned and narrowed his eyes slightly. I looked down at my hooves, unable to meet his gaze.
He's already consulted with the princess about the matter, but she refused,
he replied slowly.
It may surprise you to know that, though our princess is a benevolent soul, she tends to be stricter for rules when the royal guard is concerned.
Then...
But...
Blueblood pressed, stepping in close and causing me to stumble backwards a bit.
As her personal protege, you just might be able to convince her to give a mare some time off to be with my father.
I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The unease I was beginning to feel had grown into full-on doubt, and I found myself wanting to back out of the whole deal. The older Colt was coming on strong, his eyes flashing with something I hadn't seen before, and it was beginning to remind me of how his father looked when he addressed Crimson Storm. And that's when it hit me. Deep down, I'd already known who he was talking about, but hoped I was wrong. I now had the feeling I wasn't, and in a moment of clarity, I knew what I had to do. The Colt was intelligent, he was cunning, he was confident, but though I was younger and much more naive, I had my moments of insight. Blueblood, I began quietly. The mare that you're talking about, does she love your dad?
Of course she does,
the Colt replied without missing a beat.
She's fallen for my father just as he's fallen for her, and I only mean to make both of them happy by bringing them closer together.
He frowned again.
Why? Do you doubt my intentions? If that's the case, I can assure you...
One last thing, I interjected, looking Blueblood in the eye. Was the mare's name Crimson Storm? Blueblood's eyes briefly widened in shock before narrowing. He tried to hide whatever dark emotion he was feeling behind a mask of mild surprise, but the setting of his jaw gave him away. In that moment, he looked just like his father, and that was when the spell broke. I saw Blue Blood for what he truly was, and I found I didn't like what I saw. I could tell that he knew something was off about my reaction, and that he was trying to come up with a way to convince me to convince the princess.
Indeed,
Blue Blood finally replied, his tone somewhat clipped.
I wasn't sure that you knew about her.
He sighed heavily.
Yes, she is the one my father has his sights set on. If you know Crimson Storm, then you know she can be a bit shy. Believe me when I say she really does share my father's feelings.
No, she doesn't, I snapped, shocking Blue Blood again. She hates nobles, and she would never agree to something like that. She doesn't love your dad, and you know that, don't you? As I waited for an answer, Blue Blood's expression slowly became inscrutable. He said nothing in response, and, spurred on by his silence, I spoke again. I'm sorry, Blue Blood, I continued, shaking my head. If what you said about your mom and dad is true, I really am sorry, but I'm not gonna ask the princess to do this for you or him. After what felt like ages, Blue Blood finally replied, nodding his head slowly.
So that's it then?
He muttered, his expression still unreadable.
I suppose it was too much to ask for after all.
He spoke to his full height and inclined his head slightly, his next words spoken with an air of polite formality.
Very well then, Twilight Sparkle. I guess that means our business ends here. I'm sorry it came to this, but I will respect your decision.
He began to trot past me, and I watched him go with wary eyes. Before he got too far, he stopped and turned to look at me over his shoulder.
Just remember that you could have made some rather powerful allies had you cooperated.
He smiled.
I bid you goodbye, and good luck in your endeavors. And though we couldn't see eye to eye, I hope to see you again at the gala.
With that, he turned and trotted away, leaving me to fall to my haunches and finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I sat there for a moment, poring over everything that had transpired, and found that I wasn't angry, but sad. The one fool I thought I could call a friend had only tried to use me for his own gain. I was alone again, and though I wanted to cry, I didn't. Instead, I frowned and rose back to my hooves before resolutely marching off towards Celestia's chambers. In that moment, I realized that Crimson Storm had the right of it, and though it may not have been nearly as strong as hers, I also began to harbor a deep dislike for the nobility from that point on. As I pressed on, I resolved to forget the whole experience altogether and focus on doing my best to help Princess Celestia prepare for the upcoming gala as best I could. It seemed she was the only one I could count on after all. Chapter 6. The Gala. The night of the Grand Galloping Gala arrived, and it was just as boring and sordid as the princess had said it would be. The whole affair took place in the castle's large ballroom, which had been lavishly decorated for the occasion. Polished marble tables and plush ornate chairs had been set up throughout the entire area, with a massive open space for ponies to dance if they so desired. There was a large buffet table off to the side, and even a massive fountain of what I thought was some kind of punch at the time. When I went to partake, I was hastily informed that it was red wine which had been magically made to replenish itself within the fountain. A modestly sized orchestra full of some of the best musicians Kenterla had to offer had also been gathered together to play, and of course, there were posh, pompous, arrogant nobles everywhere I looked. The gala was full of many of the most wealthy and influential ponies in Equestria, and it was Celestia's job to greet and converse with each and every one of them. I, as her lady-in-waiting, had to sit by her side and listen to their nonsense right along with her. I sat there uncomfortably in the fancy, frilly, formal white dress the princess had made for me by the royal tailor. I smiled and nodded and looked every bit as adorable as I was supposed to, all the while hating every minute of it. I wanted desperately to complain and go off to do something, anything else. But I put up with it for Celestia's sake, as I always did. I would have much rather isolated myself in my room with my textbooks and maybe some hot chocolate, but it wasn't meant to be. Eventually, however, when the number of nobles seeking Celestia's attention had thinned out somewhat, she let me go and enjoy the festivities. I doubted there was much to enjoy, but I took the opportunity to stretch my legs and wander about all the same. I made my way around the ballroom looking for something to hold my interest, and I spotted a surprising amount of fools my age, more than I'd seen around the castle at any rate. They were all either stuffing their faces at the buffet, whining to their parents about some inane issue or another, or boasting to each other about said parents and what they'd accomplished. Already, it was all different from what the adults were doing, just louder and more obnoxious. There was one filly that caught my attention, however. Sitting alone at a table in one corner of the ballroom near the entrance was a gray earth pony filly. She sat slumped over on the table, one hoof propping her head up as she stared out at the orchestra. Unlike the other fillies who'd been adorned in ridiculously frilly dresses much like mine, she instead wore a black tailcoat, not unlike those of the ponies in the orchestra she was eyeing. At first, I simply thought she was enjoying the music, but as curiosity pulled me closer to the table where she sat, I could see the bored expression on her face. More surprisingly than that, however, was the dull lifelessness in the mulberry eyes along with her long and elegant black mane. She reminded me of Crimson Storm. Not knowing what to say, but deciding all the same that I had to say something, I quickened my pace as I moved towards her table. She flicked her eyes in my direction, but her expression didn't change, nor did she say anything as I reached the table and pulled out the other chair. The only reaction she made as I sat down across from her was to return her attention to the orchestra. I wanted to say something, introduce myself maybe, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything now that I was actually sitting there, and I became acutely aware of just how bold it had been to take a seat next to a pony I knew nothing about. Against my better judgment, I had chosen to associate myself with another, older foal who was clearly a noble. I'd told myself I wouldn't after Blue Blood, and I'd meant it. But this filly was different. Everything about her told me that she wasn't like any other high-born foal I'd seen or met. Like Crimson Storm, I'd been drawn to her by some sort of odd force I couldn't explain. But this time, I was the one with nothing to say. I opened my mouth a few times to speak, but nothing came out, and I ended up just squirming uncomfortably in my seat. Faced red with embarrassment, I eventually decided to take the other filly's cue and watch the orchestra play. And while I was no connoisseur of music, I could appreciate the skill with which they performed the rather somber piece. Wonderful, isn't it? I jumped slightly at the unexpected voice and turned to see that the filly hadn't taken her eyes off the orchestra. I'm sorry, I said nervously. Did you say something? Well, it seems you aren't going to, so I may as well. The other filly replied in a rather thick Trottingham accent. And I was thinking about this particular piece the orchestra is playing. It's a wonderful piece of music. Oh, yeah, it is. I agreed, feeling awkward. I turned back to the orchestra and watched them silently for another moment. It kinda sounds sad, though. Of course it does. It's a dirge. The filly snorted disdainfully. She waved a hoof in the air, taking on a mock tone of awe and respect. Schwarzer-Regen und Dankler Himmel in G minor, one of the lesser-known works by the late great composer Allegro Melody. Schwarzer-Regen und... I flicked an ear and gave a quizzical frown at the unfamiliar language. That's Germain, right? I tilted my head slightly in confusion. And I'm not too familiar with this kind of thing, but aren't dirges usually played at funerals or something? Why are they playing something like that at the gala? Allegro wasn't from Germany, but he had a fondness for the language, so he used it when naming a lot of his works. The older filly explained disinterestedly. And the dirge itself was my mother's idea of a clever joke. She paused as though trying to remember something. The gala may be lively, but the guests are nothing but soulless husks that don't know that they already died long ago, or something like that at any rate. This song is meant to reflect that. Oh, that's... I didn't really know what to say to that, so I trailed off and said nothing. She had mentioned it was her mother's idea, meaning her mother had probably chosen the song. I didn't know how this filly or her mother were related to the orchestra, but given the filly's attire, I assumed they were somehow involved. I decided I didn't care enough to ask about the matter, but that left us with nothing else to talk about that I could think of. We sat together in another awkward silence, but this one didn't last long before the other filly spoke again, her tone thoughtful. "I do like the song, though," she mused. "It's a rather odd creation from a stallion known for the quick and hectic pace of his many other masterpieces." She made a show of frowning in contemplation. "The way my father tells it, he originally wrote the piece in the wake of his wife's tragic death under mysterious circumstances." That caught my attention. "Really?" I asked, leaning forward, my ears perking up in interest. "How did it happen?" At that, the filly turned her head slightly to look at me. She didn't just cast me a dismissive side glance like before, but actually looked me in the eye. She looked confused at first, but after a moment, she smiled. It was a small, almost imperceptible thing, but it was the first thing I'd seen since speaking with her. "Well, that's interesting," she replied, fully turning to face me. "You're the first pony I've met who didn't immediately try to change the subject from such a morbid topic." Her small smile faltered slightly. "Aside from Mother." "I am?" I asked, frowning bemusement. "But why? Wouldn't any pony be curious about something like that?" "Most certainly not." The other filly snorted before hanging her head and frowning deeply, her eyes glazing over slightly. I barely heard her next words as she spoke. "No sane pony likes to think about death." Something in her voice caused me to wince in discomfort. I couldn't quite parse what it was at the time, but there was some kind of intense emotion behind her words, and it made me want to comfort her. Before I had the chance to respond, however, she quickly moved on, her minuscule smile returning an instant later as she raised her head. "In any case, Allegro's wife, Cantabile, died around half a millennia ago, and no pony knows exactly how," she continued, leaning forward and speaking in a low, conspiratorial, near whisper. "It's said her bloated body washed ashore on the coast not too far from Trottingham. Her dress was torn to shreds, and they found a badly rusted knife next to the body, but there were no visible wounds." "Wow, that's weird," I muttered in response. "What do you think happened?" "Well, personally..." She paused, her ears perking up, and a small, irritated frown crossing her face. I wondered why, until I noticed that there was no longer any music playing in the background. With a sigh, the filly adjusted her bow tie and hopped down from her seat before turning back to me. She gave me an apologetic smile, but what little light I saw growing in her eyes as she spoke had completely died out. Even I could see that the smile was as empty and lifeless as her eyes. "Well, it was a pleasure, but I have a prior engagement I must attend to," she exclaimed with a polite nod. "Perhaps we'll meet again at some point." Oh, right, yeah," I replied, hiding my disappointment behind a strained smile and giving a half-hearted wave. "It was nice meeting you too." She gave one last nod of acknowledgement before turning away and trotting off towards the stage where the orchestra had just finished playing. I watched her go, wondering what she was up to, but the other ponies on stage had moved off of it, and I got my answer soon enough. The filly had moved around to the back of the stage, and I lost sight of her for a moment. A minute later, 2 unicorns came back onto the stage, one of them holding what looked like a miniature bass in their magic, and the other holding a small stand and what I assumed was sheet music. While one of the ponies set up the stand and sheet music, I spotted the well-dressed filly trot onto the stage. I watched, surprised, as the filly stoically accepted the miniature bass, a cello I remind myself, and bow before stepping in front of the stand. The pony that had set up the stand lowered it enough for the filly to see the sheet music, and with that done, both of them quickly left the stage, leaving the filly on her own. It was then that I noticed just how quiet it had gotten, and I looked around to see that the majority of partygoers had stopped what they were doing and were now watching the stage. Excited whispers and muttering could be heard throughout the crowd as the filly propped herself up on her hind legs, bow in one hoof and cello in the other. She hadn't even started playing, and I was already stunned. I'd only ever been to one concert in my life at that point, and each and every musician had been a unicorn, which made sense given how easily they could manipulate instruments. It was common knowledge that string instruments in particular were exclusively used by unicorns, given how complicated it was for a pony to use them with anything other than magic. Or so I thought. I'd never seen an earth pony even attempt to use a string instrument, let alone play one, and yet this filly made wielding one without magic look almost effortless. Then, without any sort of preamble, she began to play, and the entire ballroom fell completely silent. She played with the skill of a musician 3 times her senior, and with 4 times as much experience. I didn't know the name of the song she played, but it was fast, sharp, and intense, a far cry from what the orchestra had played earlier. If I had to attach an emotion to what I heard, it would have been anger or perhaps aggravation, and I loved every second of it. I sat there at the table, watching the extremely talented filly drag the bow across the strings of her cello at a breakneck pace, completely enraptured by the sound. With some effort, I pulled my attention away from the filly on stage and saw I wasn't the only pony who had been blown away by the performance. I realized then that I never actually caught the filly's name, much to my embarrassment and frustration. The encounter had been so strange and awkward that I had forgotten to introduce myself altogether. Setting the thought aside for the moment, I swept my gaze across the throng of nobles and saw that all of them were watching the filly with rapt fascination, except for one stuffy-looking slate-gray unicorn mare near the stage. She watched the filly with something that looked like immense dissatisfaction, her jaw set in a fierce scowl, and her smoky gray eyes narrowed dangerously. The mare had a black mane tied in a French braid, and aside from the severe expression, the color of her eyes, and the fact that she was a unicorn, she was the splitting image of the filly, or rather I thought with an odd sense of dread, the filly was the splitting image of the mare. The filly didn't seem to notice, however, all of her attention focused on the music. She never faltered, never looked away from the stand, and the tense expression on her sweaty face never wavered even once. She was all but lost to the world, and when the song finally ended several minutes later, and the crowd stomped their hooves and shouted their praise, she looked as though she had been snapped out of a trance. I would have cheered right along with them, but something caught my eye at the last moment, and I turned towards the entrance of the ballroom. Standing in the shadows just outside the double doors was the one pony I never expected to see at the gala. Crimson Storm stood outside the room's saw armor, watching the crowd silently with an inscrutable look. At that moment, all thoughts of the filly and her outstanding performance left my mind, as did everything save for the red Pegasus mare standing in the doorway. It was hard to tell with her coat color, but I could just make out a slightly darker tinge of red in her cheeks. What was more noticeable was the unsteady way she stood, looking as though she might fall over at any moment, only to catch herself before she got too far. I wanted to call out to her, but something told me that would have been a very bad idea, and I instead opted to go to her. It didn't look as though she'd see me, and this was confirmed when she stepped back and began briskly trotting down the hall and out of sight. I quickly trotted to the doors before stopping and casting a brief worried glance over my shoulder at where the princess sat. She was still conversing animatedly with the gentry, so I took the opportunity to slip out after Crimson Storm, concern gnawing at me and spurring me on. Had I been paying more attention to my surroundings, I would have seen that my departure had not gone unnoticed by a certain Colt and his friends. Chapter 7. The Dungeons. I left the gala and followed after Crimson Storm, only to lose her within moments. She hadn't looked all that steady on her hooves, but apparently she was well enough to lose a filly in these mostly empty corridors. Still, something tugged at me about Crimson Storm's condition, and I couldn't help the growing dread forming in my stomach. That ominous feeling was what made me chase after her in the first place, but in doing so, I only found myself lost in an area of the castle I didn't recognize. I may have been a fool, but I wasn't completely ignorant in what some adults did in their spare time. Everything I saw about Crimson as she stood in the doorway pointed towards the mare being inebriated. And while that was extremely surprising, that wasn't what worried me. At least, that wasn't the main thing. What worried me more was why she was drunk and what her intentions were. Add to the fact that I hadn't seen her in what felt to me like ages, and there was no way in Tartarus that I wasn't going to check on her. I wandered the halls, ignoring looks of bemusement and the odd muttering or two from the few ponies trotting about as I searched. I asked a few of the guards' ponies I saw if they had seen Crimson Storm, but as soon as the name left my mouth, they'd get nervous and either deny they'd seen the mare, make some excuse and leave, or completely ignore me outright. Had I not been so worried about Crimson and frustrated with the stonewalling I was receiving, I probably would have been more suspicious. As it stood, however, the attitudes of the ones I asked only made me more determined to find the drunken guard. I wasn't sure how long it had been since I started searching, but even in my single-mindedness, I was keenly aware that the gala was going on, and that Celestia was most likely going to be wondering where I was soon. I growled and stomped a hoof in frustration at the thought that I'd have to give up the search after I'd come all this way, but it couldn't be helped. I'd already left the party and probably made the princess worry, and realized that much to my dismay, I should head back, even though I had nothing to show for my efforts. That was when I truly began to realize just how lost I was. No matter which way I looked, every passage seemed the same. I saw a couple of stairwells and began to wonder if I descended to another floor in my absent-mindedness. Thinking back, it was hard to remember exactly where my hooves had taken me, and as I wandered about, trying to find my way back, I began to panic. I called out for help, for any pony to come and show me the way back, but the corridors had become terribly empty with no nobles, castle staff, or guards in sight. Something else I noticed as tears started to stream down my face was just how shabby this part of the castle looked. The pristine marble walls had become somewhat grayed and flaky. There were far fewer doors lining the hallways, and the black and white checkered marble floors and lush maroon carpets had given way to hard gray stone. There weren't even any windows that I could see, and the more I saw, the more my frenzied panic gave way to quiet fear. I stopped shouting, because at this point, I felt I would have stumbled across some kind of monster down here in this place. It was eerily quiet, and I could hear my own tiny hoof steps echoing in the hall. I remember thinking some bad pony, or worse, would pop out of one of the few closed doors and grab me, and began to hyperventilate. I was about ready to throw all caution to the wind and charge down the hall screaming for help, when a voice somewhere behind me called my name and made me jump and scream anyway. To my own credit, or perhaps stupidity, given the situation, I didn't immediately flee for my life. Rather, I turned with wide fearful eyes to see the owner of the voice and came face to face with none other than Blueblood the Seventh. The cult, against all odds, had somehow found me in the Celestia Forsaken corridor. I almost thought he wasn't real, and the fact that he was should have raised a few questions, but I was too out of it to care at the moment. All hostility, all suspicion, disapproval, and decency, all of that was shunted aside as I slammed into the teenage cult and wrapped him in a tight, shaky hug. I sobbed and wheezed into his withers, his look of concern turning into one of shock, then cautious reassurance as he uncomfortably patted me on the back. After a moment, my sobs became sniffles, and I finally managed to take a step back and collect my thoughts another moment after that. "I apologize if I scared you. That wasn't my intention," Blueblood said with a warm if apologetic smile. "Do you feel any better now?" I nodded mutely as I sniffed again and wiped my eyes. Now that the fear and panic had abated, I was left feeling awkward and embarrassed at my own display. Blue Blood just seemed to take my sour silence in stride, his concerned look returning as he spoke again.
That's good to hear, but if I may ask, what are you doing all the way down here, Miss Sparkle?
He inquired, looking around him.
This is quite a ways from the gala.
He looked back to me with a quizzical expression.
I'd expected you to be by the princess's side, yet here you are, lost and alone in this dreadful place.
I was looking for some pony, I muttered, not meeting his eye. I got lost and ended up here somehow. Now that I was able to think clearly, I remembered my dislike for the cult, and in light of that, I wasn't willing to give him any more information than that. Of course, there wasn't much more information to give other than that the pony I happened to be searching for was Crimson Storm, but that hardly mattered to me at that time. That aside, the more important questions to be asked were once again at the forefront of my mind, so I asked them. "What are you doing here?" I replied, my eyes narrowing slightly as I rose my head to face Blue Blood. "How did you even find me here?"
"The gods,"
the cult answered simply.
"I'd been meaning to speak with you during the gala and apologize about our previous altercation, but you were nowhere to be found."
He trotted past me and down the hall a bit before stopping and turning back to me with a small smirk.
"I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Miss Sparkle, but you've gained a reputation for being something of an introvert, a loner if you will, and I simply assumed you decided to return to your room for the night. Imagine my surprise when I checked to find that you weren't there either."
"You went to my room? And what do you mean, loner?" I squawked, taken aback. "I mean, sure, I like to be left alone sometimes, and I spend a lot of time in my room when I'm not with the princess, but I don't think I'm a loner." The argument didn't sound very strong in my own ears, and we both knew that what he said was the truth. In the days following my declination of Blue Blood's offer, I'd usually spend my time alone in my room when I wasn't helping Princess Celestia prepare. Even before that, I'd spent a great deal of time studying alone whenever I could.
"Come now, Miss Sparkle. It's clear for any pony to see that you aren't particularly fond of company."
He sighed and bowed his head.
"And I'm afraid I have to take some blame for that. I know what you must think of me after our disagreement, and you're right. I was wrong to try and use you for my own gain, and I apologize for that. That's what I wanted to tell you during the gala. When I didn't see you at the gala, I slipped out to look for you, and grew worried when I was informed that you hadn't returned to your chambers either,"
he explained, his expression turning serious.
"I asked around and found that you'd come this way, so I followed after you and found you here."
"Oh," I replied, not really knowing what else to say. I eyed the cult, looking for any sign of insincerity, but his words and look seemed earnest enough, so I chose to let bygones be bygones. "Well, thanks, I guess, for the apology, and for looking for me. I don't know how long I could have been stuck here, wherever we are." I frowned and scanned the area once again. "Where are we, anyway?"
"You don't know?"
Blue Blood asked, apparently surprised. He chuckled a moment later and trotted ahead, motioning for me to follow.
"In that case, let's head back and I'll tell you what I know along the way."
I hesitated for a moment, looking from Blue Blood's retreating form to the opposite side of the hall where I'd originally come from. I could have sworn I heard other hoofsteps besides our own, but another nervous look around revealed nothing. After a few seconds, I bit my lip worriedly and moved to catch up with the cult. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I muttered, glancing behind me. "I'm pretty sure the exit's back that way. At least I think it is."
"There's another set of stairs closer this way,"
Blue Blood replied with calm confidence.
"I wouldn't exactly call it a shortcut per se, but it's close enough. Once we reach the staircase and head straight up, we should end up on the first floor a little ways from the ballroom."
All right then, if you say so." I replied, just happy to finally be leaving this horrible place. We trotted along quietly for a moment while Blueblood got his bearings, and unable to stand the eerie quiet, I spoke first. So, what is this place, and how do you know so much about it? My father brought me here once for something of a history lesson, Blueblood explained. He turned to look at me from over his shoulder. Are you aware of just how old this castle is, Miss Sparkle? Well, I answered, trying to rack my brain for the information. According to Princess Celestia, Kennerlock Castle was built a little over 990 years ago. She told me she herself had a hoof in the design. She certainly did, chuckled Blueblood. But as you know, times change, and oftentimes the past is forgotten and left behind in favor of the future. That's true for a lot of things, including architecture. This place. And he gestured to the dirty, flaking gray walls and cracked stone floor. Happens to be an old abandoned part of the castle. So old that I even doubt the princess has even thought about these ancient corridors in ages. Wow, I nearly whispered, looking around the hall in wonder. The fact that I was trotting through a place of ancient history put these unsettling corridors in a new light for me. So rather than remodel the place, Princess Celestia left it as it was? A strange decision, in my opinion, but I wasn't going to explain, though my curiosity had been piqued. So, where do these halls lead anyway? I'm so glad you asked, Blueblood answered as he pushed open a heavy-looking wooden door with his magic. You see, the reason these halls were abandoned was because the princess had more use for them after the war against the Minotaurs. We stepped through the creaky door, and I froze, my eyes wide with shock and confusion. Before me was a set of steep cobblestone steps leading down into a thick, musky darkness. I couldn't see anything below, but as I stared into that darkness, my mind wandered elsewhere. Equestria was a different place back then, or so my father tells me, I heard Blueblood say from somewhere distant. Back in the war, we would capture and interrogate prisoners until they spilled their secrets, and these halls led to the very place where captured prisoners would be held. It happened in an instant. I'd been so distracted by a memory that had been trying to push itself to the surface that I was completely caught off guard when I felt something shove me forward. A cry of surprise became loud, sharp yelps of agony as I stumbled, tripped, and rolled head over hoof down the steps. I felt something catch and tug at my dress a moment before a terrible ripping sound reached my ears. I gave a pained grunt as I hit the cold, hard ground below. I groaned and whimpered at the sharp pain shooting up one of my back legs, and winced at the overall soreness beginning to spread throughout the rest of my body. I'd definitely hit my head at some point during the fall, and it pounded incessantly. Though thankful my horn hadn't gotten caught, but even in my addled state, I knew it wasn't a good idea to try and use magic. I tried to rise to my hoofs, but cried out and fell back down into a heap as another stab of pain buckled my leg. I'd been knocked senseless by the tumble and found it incredibly hard to concentrate on any one thing. My vision was hazy with tears and spots of black, making it even harder to see anything in the gloom around me. I coughed a pain-filled cough, grunted and winced as I shifted my weight, and craned my neck up towards the top of the steps. My eyes widened as I saw not only Blueblood's outline, but two others as well, peering down at me from just beyond the doorway. My mind worked furiously to figure out just what was going on, but the pain in my leg overrode any sense of rational thought for the moment, and I could only whimper helplessly. A bit much, don't you think, Winterchime? Came a familiar and slightly irritated voice of Blueblood. If she suffers any sort of permanent injury, things are not going to go well for us. There was a beat of silence, and the shadow of the colt leaned in close to the other silhouetted pony and hissed. And if things don't go well for us, I'll make sure they go much worse for you. Got it? Yeah,
I got it, Blue Blood. Sorry. Another familiar voice squeaked. It won't happen again. I promise. You better make sure it doesn't.
Now then. There was a clearing of the throat, and the largest silhouette began to make its way down the steps. I apologize on behalf of Winter Chime, Miss Sparkle. I assure you I had every intention of having this chat of ours peacefully and without any pony getting hurt. But, well... I could see the outline of Blue Blood shrug. There's nothing for it now, I guess. As I listened to the colt, my eyes flickered over to the other two still standing at the top of the steps. There was no doubt about it. The friends Blue Blood had ditched before were back, and they'd all been working together to... what? Why were they doing this? I had gotten the feeling Winter Chime didn't like me very much for some reason. That had been evident from the point I met her. That she was apparently the one who had pushed me down the steps didn't surprise me at all. But what about Greedy Gut? I could tell he was the other pony in the doorway, but he hadn't said anything about what was going on, and I couldn't make out his face from here. He simply looked on from above as Blue Blood continued to casually make his way down the steps towards me. Then the door slammed shut, leaving Blue Blood and I completely alone. I yelped at the noise and tried to scramble to my hooves again, only to be painfully reminded of my current condition. I wasn't sure if my leg was broken, and now I couldn't see if it was, but it certainly felt like it. For a few moments, everything was suddenly bathed in complete darkness, then a bright blue light from somewhere above me lit up the area. I looked back up to see Blue Blood's horn aglow, the light casting unnerving shadows over his features and the walls around us. He looked down at me, wearing that pleasant, charming grin, as though he was taking a leisurely stroll in the castle gardens, but I could see nothing else in his eyes that made me shiver. Maybe I'd just been imagining it due to the light, but somehow I doubted that. Now I realize how this all seems, but it was only my intention to talk, nothing more than that. He sighed and shook his head as he reached the bottom of the staircase. Honestly, I'd meant to bring you somewhere more... He looked around him with a disgusted grimace. Aesthetically pleasing than this, but it serves my purposes well enough. Why? I mewed weakly. Blue Blood, I sucked in a breath and whimpered again as I accidentally put weight on my back leg. My leg. Blue Blood, I need help. Please. I wanted to cry in earnest. I wanted to scream and wail and bawl my eyes out. I should have, and I think I normally would have, but somehow I managed to hold it back. My amethyst eyes, wet with tears and wide with pain and pleading, met Blue Blood's calm, almost impassive blue orbs. After a long, tense moment of silence, save for my ragged breathing, Blue Blood trotted past me and further into the darkness beyond the stairs. Honestly, I'm not sure how Father can stand to see ponies like this. He mused aloud as he moved further and further away. I've always preferred words over hooves when it came to getting what I want personally. I've tried to see it his way, but this isn't just doing it for me. He stopped a short distance away and turned back to me, looking me over with a deep frown. I matched his frown with a pathetic whine and another wince of pain, and he snorted before turning away and speaking again. Lucky for you, my mother had the sense to teach me some minor healing magic before she betrayed my father and disgraced our family. But we'll have to hold off on that, I think. Though I dislike seeing you in such pain, this also suits my needs. At least, for the moment. His voice echoed off the walls ominously, and I couldn't help but shiver again. Blue Blood? I asked, struggling to turn so that I faced the colt. I chanced a glance behind me, and in the dim light of Blue Blood's horn, it didn't look like anything was broken, but there had probably been a sprain at least, and the fancy white dress I wore was ruined, practically in tatters at the bottom. I clenched my teeth against the spike of pain and turned back to Blue Blood. What are you talking about? Why did you...
As I said before, I wanted us to be able to talk in private. You and I.
Blueblood interjected.
To be completely candid, Miss Sparkle, I haven't quite given up on this deal of ours just yet, and I wanted to.
He had his back turned to me, but I could see him roll a hoof around in the air as he searched for the right words to say.
Rework the conditions of the offer. Before that, though, I believe you wanted to know where these halls lead, correct? Well, I was going to tell you before I was so rudely interrupted. Again, I'm sorry about that.
He paused a moment and looked up, his head moving back and forth as he searched for something I couldn't see. Another second later, the lights surrounding his horn went out, and the room was pitch black once again. It didn't last long before Blueblood's horn lit up again, this time only flashing once. There was a soft whoosh, followed by several more, as sconces previously unseen began to blaze one by one along one wall. In the soft orange glow, I thought we'd wound up in some kind of hallway made of dark gray flatstone, but that wasn't the case. On one side of the room, across from the lit sconces, I could see rows of cells with thick iron bars, some open, some tight shut, and others with the bars snapped off in places. There was a barred door at the end of the room far behind Blueblood, leading deeper into the dark, stony room. The memory that had been gnawing at me since I first saw the stone steps suddenly came rushing back to me with the intensity of a hurricane.
Dark room at the bottom of a stone staircase, Crimson Storm laughing, Captain Blueblood, battered and broken and ripped apart. Blood, dark and sticky, on the ground, the walls, stuck to her hooves, in her fur, her mane, her teeth. Or was that me?
I muttered, my eyes losing focus as I tried to remember.
Was Crimson Storm really there? Or was that me? I can't.
My unfocused gaze returned to the older Colt, making his way back over to me, all confident smiles.
Was it Blueblood?
A pleasant thrill coursed through my entire body as the images warped and twisted in my mind. I watched as though I was outside looking in as the madly laughing red mare became a giggling lavender filly. I watched as the bloodied white stallion became a mangled and mutilated white colt.
What is this? Is that the dream I had?
The thoughts swirled together in my mind until I could no longer discern the difference between the actual dream and what my mind had only just conjured up. Somewhere deep down, I could feel the sharp pain in my leg and the lesser pain in my other extremities. But that and the growing confusion and disorientation was becoming drowned out by an oddly pleasant tingle coursing through my body. It was almost enough to make me laugh aloud, despite the pain.
There we go,
came Blueblood's voice, finally snapping me out of whatever reverie I'd been in.
That's much better.
He stopped in front of me and looked around again, his smile falling into another sour grimace.
Well, maybe not. This place is rather filthy, but that's to be expected after hundreds of years of neglect.
He shook his head and tutted in mock disappointment before turning back to me, his smile once more back in place. He raised a hoof and swept it across the room in a grand gesture.
In any case, Twilight Sparkle, allow me to welcome you to the abandoned dungeons beneath Canterlot Castle.
Chapter 8. The Fractured Mask. Blueblood silently paced back and forth in front of me with a thoughtful frown. I paid him little attention, my mind still trying to come to terms with the images I'd seen. In light of that, it didn't matter to me what Blueblood wanted, or that I was even down here alone in some old dungeons where I most likely wouldn't be getting any help. In that moment, it didn't matter that I was injured, it didn't matter that my dress was ruined, and it didn't matter that I'd been tricked. My small frame still tingled oddly from the pleasant sensation those horribly macabre thoughts had given me, and I squirmed uncomfortably, unsure whether to be amused or afraid in this situation. But why would I be amused at all? I wondered. There was nothing amusing about being injured and stuck down in an old abandoned dungeon and at the mercy of some pony who most likely had nothing good planned for you. And yet, something inside me found the whole thing utterly ridiculous. Laughable, even. "I'm curious, Miss Sparkle," Blueblood began suddenly. "You've gone quite far out of your way just to go looking for this pony. What made you think they'd be all the way down here?" He stopped his pacing and moved in close, lowering his head so that he was eye level with me. "Who exactly was it that you were looking for?" "None of your business," I heard myself growl through clenched teeth. "I got turned around and wound up here. That's all. It doesn't matter anyway because they weren't here." I was still unsure of how to feel, so instead, I opted for defiance. Blueblood had said he didn't want to hurt me, but I couldn't be sure of that given his other lies. Being scared, however, wasn't getting me anywhere, and while I was still worried, I could at least manage to put up a brave front. "Yes, that is a shame," Blueblood sighed as he straightened up and stepped back. "But I'm fairly sure I already know who you were so desperately trying to locate." He cast a sly smirk my way. "It was Crimson Storm, right? That creepy royal guard?" She's not creepy," I snapped before grunting in pain. She just isn't good at talking to ponies. That's no reason for every pony to be scared of her." "Oh, it's not Crimson Storm every pony is scared of, Miss Sparkle, I assure you." Blueblood chuckled mirthlessly. "Rather, they're scared of the one holding her reins, as it were." "What?" I asked, dumbfounded. "What are you talking about? Holding her reins? What does that mean?" "Crimson Storm wasn't always the way she is now, you know," Blueblood continued, as though he hadn't even heard my question. "She used to be a lot like you, actually. Shy, introverted, naive as sin, but ultimately a nice pony that was easy to get along with." He paused, sighed, and shook his head. "But then she caught my father's eye, the poor mare." I grimaced, half from the pain in my leg, and half from the thought of the elder Blueblood. I knew from the beginning that there was something wrong with the stallion, but I had no idea just how horrible he really was. Not until his son laid it out for me. "My father, Prince Blueblood VI, Captain of the Royal Guard, head of House Blueblood, one of the wealthiest and most influential ponies alive." The colt snorted. "And without a doubt, one of the most ruthless ponies in existence. I'm not sure if you've met my father, but he is not a stallion to be trifled with." "I've seen him before," I replied quietly, my eyes wandering from the colt as I thought back to the interaction between the captain and Crimson Storm. "I could see for myself that your dad wasn't a very nice pony." "That, at least, is something we can agree on." Blueblood responded with a small smirk. It soon fell into a frown as he began his pacing once more. "Like Crimson Storm, my father used to be a different stallion. He was still a cold and calculating sort, but he had a heart. Somewhere in there." His frown deepened into a dark scowl. "Until my mother found it and tore it out." I watched Blueblood carefully and saw that the hurt in his expression was genuine. I believed him, but no longer sympathized like I did the last time he'd mentioned what happened with his mother. To any pony else, this would have been so surprising given the circumstances, but I found it strange. "We were happy. Well, as was reasonable to be at any rate. But my mother..." He snorted.
or his father was fond of calling her, that harlot, found another stallion to keep her warm at night, it seems. And that's when things fell apart for our family. We were, and still are, fine as far as finances and power are concerned. But the reputation of the household of Blue Blood took quite a hit, and my father changed after that, drastically. It was his turn to wince as he spoke. He grew more bitter, surly, angry, violent, especially around mares.
Did he hurt you? I found myself asking deep down for entirely the wrong reasons. Did he? Wait. Everything clicked together, and my eyes widened in realization. He hurt Crimson Storm.
Hurt Crimson Storm?
Blueblood laughed joylessly.
Miss Sparkle, he broke Crimson Storm. That's what he does now. He broke her down over time and made sure that any pony who realized what was going on stayed silent about it. He is, after all, a very powerful stallion in almost every sense of the word.
So, all those ponies that wouldn't tell me what was wrong with Crimson Storm? I muttered, my eyes wide and once again growing wet with tears. All this time, the reason she was so...
Now you begin to understand, Twilight Sparkle,
Blueblood exclaimed, jabbing a hoof in my direction.
When I said Crimson Storm had caught my father's eye, it wasn't as a potential lover, but as a simple plaything to vent his frustrations on.
He let his hoof drop and gave a heavy sigh before falling to his haunches in front of me, his expression weary and resigned as he looked at me.
And where do you fit in all of this? Where do we fit in all of this?
That was a good question, I thought. Where did we fit in all of this? From what I could see, and by the way he spoke, it didn't seem like Blueblood agreed with what his father was doing. And yet here I was, still bruised, still sore, still unable to stand, even though he apparently had the magic to heal me. He said he didn't like seeing me hurt, and yet refused to take the pain away simply because it suited him to keep me in this state. And for what? So he'd have a captive audience to listen to his monologue? His sob story about his family? The only thing I cared about was what his father had done to Crimson Storm. As these thoughts took hold, my tears began to dry up, the horror of what I'd discovered slowly being replaced with something altogether different. My open mouth slowly closed shut, then turned down in a slight frown, and I didn't reply to Blueblood's question. The older colt seemed not to notice though, lost in his own words as he was, and continued speaking.
It's quite simple, really, Blueblood continued, pushing one lock of his golden mane out of his face. I want my father back, like how he used to be before Mother's betrayal. After he's had his way with that Pegasus mare, he comes home and for a time I get my father back.
He looked away from me, his eyes distant and wistful, his voice quiet and slightly shaky.
You have no idea what that means to me. No idea.
He grew quiet and stayed that way for a long minute before turning back to me with a small smile. My frown only deepened at that smile. There was something off about it. That, and his eyes. There was something desperate about his expression, something slightly unhinged.
That's why I need you, Miss Sparkle,
he explained, rising to his hooves and taking a step closer.
You are most likely the closest pony to the princess right now. It is you, above all others, who have her ear.
He lowered his head and practically pushed his face into mine, his eyes and smile growing wider and wider by the second.
You can convince her to give Crimson Storm to my father, and then I can have my father back, and things will be like they were before.
He was practically shouting in his excitement, and all the while, my disgust and anger were mingling, mixing together to create something I'd never experienced before. There was an insistent pounding in the back of my head, and my heart was thumping loudly in my chest. Somewhere deep down, that odd sensation was beginning to rise again, but I tried to push it back down, afraid something horrible would happen if I let it overtake me. Then the strangest thing happened. My eyes by chance happened to flick away from Blue Blood's face and to the room behind him. Off a little ways into the distance, near one of the cells with the broken iron bars, I spotted several of the bars that had snapped off lying scattered about. Some long, some short, all of them very sharp at one end. I looked back at Blue Blood, and another image flashed across my mind. But this was no dream. It was an idea. It was an idea involving one of those iron bars, some simple levitation, and a decent amount of force, enough to drive metal through flesh and bone. This was not an idea that a filly should have. This was not an idea that any pony should have had. And yet there it was. And the more Blue Blood spoke, the better the idea seemed.
This is why I haven't given up. This is why we're down here now, and why I'm talking to you.
Blue Blood was raving, completely oblivious to my internal struggle.
I need this Twilight Sparkle. Do you understand? Crimson Storm may suffer for it to some degree, but that would be a small price to pay for the love of a father, don't you think? What say you, Miss Sparkle? Will you help me? Will you talk to the princess? You will be rewarded handsomely. Whatever in my family's power to give you. Just name it, and...
I don't care about your dad, and I don't care about you, Blue Blood. And after what he did to Crimson Storm, I hope he burns in Tartarus. I hope both of you do. I'm not telling the princess to do anything, so you can go tell that to your stupid father. It was my voice. They were my words, but I could scarcely believe either to be the case. All the anger had drained out of my tone and was replaced with something dark and cold. My heartbeat had quickened significantly, and the pounding in my head had grown so bad I could feel it reverberating in my spine. But it didn't hurt, oddly enough. Blue Blood, for his part, seemed to have frozen, his eerily wide smile locked in place. For a moment, we both stared at each other, and eventually, his smile gradually melted away and his expression grew blank. At the same time, that feeling I'd been working so hard to hold back started to slip through, and it was my turn to smile. I smiled, and in that tense silence, with my heart thumping and my head pounding, my horn began to light up, almost it felt of its own accord. My eyes never left Blue Blood's, but I could feel my magic wrap reassuringly around something further behind him. I knew what I was about to do, and I knew it was bad, but in the face of satisfaction I'd soon feel, the consequences didn't register. Nothing registered except for the weight of the cold iron and the end of this stupid situation. It had seemed absurd to me before, and now I knew why. It was because I could just heal Blue Blood and be done with the whole thing. So simple a solution that a fool could have come up with it. So simple that... Something smashed into my horn and everything went white, my world suddenly exploding in pain. I cried out, trying to cover my face with bruised legs, as blows continued to rain down one after another. My magic winked out, and somewhere in the distance, past the almost unbearable pain, I could hear something hit the floor with a loud metallic clang. It was clear Blue Blood hadn't noticed, as he was far too busy trying to pummel every inch of me he could reach. I could hear him grunting and growling with rage, sputtering furious, half-formed words as he swung at me repeatedly. I could see his face, his wild eyes bulging out of his head, and his mouth twisted in a horrible snarl. At some point, I'd curled up on the ground, trying to protect myself from Blue Blood's assault. It felt like an eternity before it ended, but end it did, and just as abruptly as it had started. I was left lying there, a whimpering, blubbering mess of bruises. Both the terribly pleasant sensation and horrifying, murderous intent had long since gone, beaten right out of me. Ultimately, it was probably for the best, but at that moment, I would have given anything to feel that instead of the pain I was feeling now. Then, everything stopped. A series of outraged grunts and protests from Blue Blood caused me to open my eyes, which had been squeezed shut and were already starting to swell. What I saw gave me more than a bit of pause, and my mouth fell open in shock. Sitting on her haunches with a furious colt locked and struggling in her front legs was Crimson Storm. Looking up to where the entrance was, I could see that the door was open and Blue Blood's friends were nowhere in sight. I turned back to the red mare, my heart swelling with relief and gratitude, but that quickly died out when I saw the look on her face. Whereas Blue Blood's expression had been full of white-hot rage, Crimson Storm's face was a calm mask, but the ice-cold fury in her eyes was all too easy to see, and all of it was directed at Blue Blood. Her cheeks were still stained with a slightly darker shade of red, but it looked as though any other semblance of inebriation had vanished.
Crimson Storm?
I croaked between painful coughs, still unable to believe what I was seeing.
You're here. How did you... I'm sorry you had to go through all this, Twilight,
she replied, her tone just as flat as it always was, despite the situation and her obvious fury. Her eyes remained fixed on the struggling colt as she spoke.
I meant to see you sooner, but I haven't been able to. I've been busy, but I'm here now, and everything is going to be just fine. He won't hurt you. Not anymore. He won't hurt you.
One of her legs tightened around Blue Blood's neck, and he gave a choked gurgle. His furious indignation replaced with fear and panic as the gravity of his situation finally settled over him. Once Crimson Storm was certain the colt was lucid, she released a bit of the pressure and smiled down at him. It was the first time I'd seen her smile in any capacity. It was a terrible smile, full of hatred and ill intent. It was a smile that reminded me of the dream I'd had. It was a smile that reminded me of the one I'd given Blue Blood just as I was about to do something very, very bad. I suddenly felt sick.
Crimson Storm?
I began in a horrified near whisper.
What are you doing? This is why I hate nobles, Twilight,
she continued, as though I hadn't even spoken.
They're all the same. All of them. And the wealthy, renowned, revered House of Blue Blood?
She gave an unsteady chuckle, her eyes clouding over slightly as she peered down at the now terrified colt.
Well, like father like son, as they say.
Her voice had become shaky and unstable, the pitch rising higher as she spoke. I watched with no amount of unease as she leaned in close to Blue Blood and whispered in his ear, her wide smile falling into a knowing grin.
Isn't that right, you little monster?